Alarm columns. Let's take a closer look inside the alarm tab pages and more specifically to the columns that are available there. Basically, those are the properties of the alarms being shown in those columns. Okay, so first of all, I want to emphasize that by default, there are only a select number of properties being shown. We can easily add more or show more properties as we wish. We'll immediately take a look at that. First, I'll highlight a couple of the properties that might be worth mentioning here. Typically, those are the ones that are being shown by default, but not all of them. So we have the columns or the properties like element name, parameter description, value, etc. So of course the element name, that's the name of the element where the alarm is happening. So make sure you have a good name there for your elements. The element type is something that is defined in the driver. So in the driver that is being used for this element, we can specify if it's like a router or a switch, if it's a microservice or a server, I should say, or if it's an encoder or an IRD or anything like that. Next up is the parameter description. The parameter description specifies where the alarm is happening, if it's like on a CPU utilization or a memory or a bitrate parameter. So that will be clearly defined in the parameter description. Next is the value, and the value is important because we need to know when the alarm happens, of course, what the reason is why the alarm is happening, but also note that the value is being taken at the moment when the alarm is being generated. Meaning, if I have an alarm happening this morning at 8 o'clock because the temperature is here getting too high, it could be at 30 degrees, but maybe in the meantime, it's already 33 degrees. So be aware that the real-time value is not shown in the value column here, but remember that you can open up the side panel on the right-hand side of your alarm console, and if you select the alarm, you can see the real-time value there. Here we see the value at the time the alarm was generated. Now for the time, we do see time, but also root time. What's the difference? The root time is basically when the alarm was originally starting. So it could be starting this morning at 8 o'clock. Maybe the temperature was 25 degrees then. Then we have, for instance, a warning alarm. But over time, like an hour later at 9 o'clock, the temperature further increases and it was like 30 degrees and it went to a critical alarm. That basically means that the alarm, the time of the alarm, will be 9 o'clock for the critical and the root time will be 8 o'clock because it originally started as a warning at 8 o'clock. So over time, an alarm can have multiple changes and you will always find back the root time, the originating time when the alarm was the first happening. Next to that, we have the severity. That's clear, I guess. That's indicating the severity also in the color-coded line in front of your alarms that is being visualized. Next is the alarm type, and the alarm type is an interesting one because over there you can actually see those changes that might happen to your alarm over time. An alarm always starts as a new alarm. That's the first occurrence. It happens and we pick it up and it is a new alarm. But as I mentioned just before, it could start as a warning and over time go to a critical alarm. That means that it could drop or escalate, in my case, escalate from warning to critical and then maybe go back and it drops again from critical to warning. So the severity can change over time with the dropped and the escalated events. And it could also have a flipped, that's a special case where it would go from critical high to critical low. We also have changes like an acknowledgement that can happen. Somebody takes ownership of the alarm or he or she releases again the ownership and then it would be unresolved. Masking or unmasking an alarm is also something you can do or simply add some comments to the alarm. Things in the system can change, like the name of the element can change or the service impact can change, for instance. So those are a number of changes that can happen over time where you will clearly see that an alarm evolves. Let me quickly show you an example. So we do have some new alarms in here. So like the first one on my DMA info, the memory utilization or usage of the WMI process is 10,112. Let me show the side panel. And here we can see that the real-time value is already increasing a little bit more to 10,156. So here you can see the real time, here you can see the actual value when it was being picked up at 2:17 in the afternoon. Then let me also take a look, scroll down a little bit to an alarm where we have some history. We can see that with the icon and in front with the double lines and the arrow. There we can see that this alarm was actually generated yesterday, but we can see that it is already actually for a few years in my system. So the root time is very old. It's already for years in my system. And yesterday there was a change, apparently in RCA level that changed. Let me take another look at this one. Here we can see some levels dropped and things like that. So we can see the history in there as well, or we can also open it up. We'll further take a look at the alarm lifecycle later on, but remember that the time is the last change. The root time is when it originally started. Now, what else do we have in there? Also a column status. What is status? Typically an alarm is just open or it's cleared. Normally when it's cleared, it will by default be removed from your UI and you won't see it. There are although some possible ways of keeping them in your alarm console. We'll take a look at that later on. Next to open and cleared, there is also the masked state. The masked state meaning that you've suppressed, or somebody in the system suppressed the alarm, meaning that, yeah, we're aware of that situation. We don't need to worry about it. They're probably working on something, so it's kind of expected that the alarm is there. We just move it away to the masked tab page. So that's why we have that status that could potentially go to masked. But typically it's open or it's cleared, it's gone. We also have the owner fields. The owner field is where it basically starts generated by the system, but I can take ownership of the alarm, and then my username would be tagged on the alarm so that the other people can see like, oh, Bert is working on this issue, so I should no longer take a look at that. The owner is combined with the user status field, which is by default not assigned. A new alarm coming in is not assigned. But if I take ownership, my name appears on it and it also becomes acknowledged. And then this is the alarm where it's no longer blinking, if you remember the blinking feature from the cube sidebar. If I release the ownership again, it would go to the unresolved state. So there is a subtle difference. When a new alarm comes in, it is not assigned. I take ownership, then it's acknowledged. If I release the ownership again, it doesn't go back to not assigned, but it goes back to unresolved because previously there was somebody working on it. Okay, we do have some other columns like comments. To display the columns immediately inside your alarm console, you can show that column. There's also the source. Potentially for some filtering purposes, you want to pick up something on a correlated alarm. Typically an alarm is generated by the DataMiner system, but also the correlation engine could, for instance, generate alarms. Then we have two interesting fields on the service impact. First of all, we have the service impact. That's just a number. And you could use that for sorting purposes or filtering purposes, because this will just be 0, no service impact, or 1, 2, 3, 4, but you don't know which services. To know which services, you need to take a look at the next column. That's the services. There you will see an enumeration of all the names of the services which are being impacted by this element alarm. So service impact is a number, services is the list of the names of the services. Then we also have the RCA level. The RCA level was linked to the RCA filter. So by default, an RCA level will be none.none.none if there are no connectivity chains defined in your system. If you enrich your system and you explain to DataMiner that specific devices or elements or parameters are linked to each other and you make a connectivity chain, then you will have a number there, and then you will see if the RCA level or root cause analysis level is 0, being the root cause, or 1 or 2 or 3, basically the distance to the most probable root cause. Last one I want to mention here is the alarm ID. There is always a unique reference to a specific alarm. So if you want to reference that, for instance, in a trouble ticketing system, you can do so by using the alarm ID. Now, those are some columns that we have by default that I wanted to highlight, but you can of course change the order, but also which columns that are being shown. So to do so, you need to right click on any of the headers of your columns. In the right click menu, you will find the add and remove column option, and it will give you a sub menu with all the possible fields that are available for the alarms. And there are quite a lot of them. So you do have some standard properties of the alarm. Let us take a look at that. Let's maybe hide the side panel for a moment again. And let's take a look at that. So I right click on any of the column headers, doesn't really matter which one. And I go to add and remove column. And you can see there's a whole series of possibilities. Let me maybe right click over there so that we see if I disable the icon. So the ones with the checkbox are the ones that are currently visible. You can see the line in front of the alarm, that's the icon. So you can remove the icon yes or no. For the element, it displays the element name, but maybe you also want to visualize the polling IP. We do have a lot of local hosts here on this demo system. Or you can choose the element type or the protocol or the description. Not only a name, but also a description is being specified when creating an element. Next to that, the focus, that's the column with the focus icon. So when an alarm is something that you should potentially take a look at because it's a little bit of a focus alarm, not the kind of clutter that we want to remove away. Next is the parameter description. Interesting to note, you have parameter description and you also have parameter and parameter key. What's the difference? Well, let me activate those ones as well, just as an example. Normally, when you just have something like output gain, it is output gain and no key. The description could also be linked to a table with transport streams, with interfaces. In this case, it's a task manager. So it is a table with all the processes in there. And for each process, you have CPU, you have memory usage. In this case, the memory usage of the process WMI is generating an alarm. So you can actually split those two and you have the parameter, the column of the task manager, and you have the index, the WMI process that is in there. So that's actually splitting up the parameter description for the ones that are table in the parameter and the parameter key. So by default, we show the combined version that is combining the parameter and the parameter key. But if you want, you can basically split them up in parameter and parameter key. The value, that's of course an important one, the time, the root time, severity duration, maybe just a quick highlight. That's how long an alarm has been in a certain severity. So that's a counter counting up. That's potentially an interesting one you want to activate. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can find some more information on the help if you would not, or if you would be in doubt about some of them. What I do want to mention also, there is this trend that I can activate. So you can see here on the right hand side, it activates a small trend spark line for the parameters that have trending available. And you also have heat lines you can activate for the element and for a parameter, meaning that you will immediately inline see for the specific elements the last 24-hour alarm state line, and for the parameter, the last 24-hour state timeline. So this is for the complete elements that the alarm concerns about. So there could be some influence of other parameters. That's for the single parameter that we are currently looking at in this alarm here. It's a little bit like the report page you have here, but inline inside your alarm console. Let me disable those again to keep it clean. And we also have an interesting actions item. The actions allow you to add inline inside the list some action buttons to take ownership, to do masking, to clearing, copying, adding comments, sending a text message, etc. Let me just add two of them, ownership and masking, the most frequently used, you could say. Of course, you can reorganize that, put them at the front, for instance, and you can immediately say like, okay, this first alarm, I will work on it. I will take ownership. And immediately this is my name somewhere here, Bert Vandenberg, is added on this alarm. You can also mask an alarm here right from the list without using the right-click menu. But we will come back to alarm masking and the alarm taking ownership in the management in the next video. Okay, so those were some of the most important properties that I can add, properties or columns. So I added some standard properties, but also the trend line and the heat line. I added some special action buttons in there. And there are also some user-definable properties that we can add. Remember from the Cube sidebar that we added on some devices some additional information, like if it's a gold, silver, or bronze class where the alarms are happening here. Well, let me right-click again on the element and go to the properties, go to custom, and I added before the BERT class. If I go back to the edit, there was one option which was important to be able to use it in the alarm console. That is this option here. Make this property available for alarm filtering. Originally it was not activated. I've just activated it to make it available. So I'm now make this BERT class available for my alarming. And now, if I right-click on any of the columns, take a look at the add and remove columns, and I scroll down, I will notice I have indeed element properties, service properties, and view properties in there. Underneath the element properties, I do find that BERT class property, and I can just visualize it, and you can immediately see here on the right-hand side, or let me move it to the front, which ones are gold devices or which one were silver devices. Like IRD01 is silver, that is indeed silver. So without looking at my elements or my surveyor, from within the alarm console, I can immediately enrich that with information about those alarms. If it's a gold or silver element, or maybe it is included in a service, which is a gold or a silver, or it's inside a site, which is manned or unmanned. So any additional properties with additional information can be immediately visualized inside your alarm console. So now I simply added an element property, but you can do the same for a service property and a view property. So remember, you can add those additional properties by right-clicking on there, going to properties, and going to custom to add additional pieces of information there. There is one special property, and that's the alarm properties. So we had the element properties, service properties, and view properties, but there are also the alarm properties. I'll immediately add an alarm property. But before I do so, the last item is also interesting here. set default columns. If you would ever have too many columns or you want to go back to the default, you can just go for set default columns and it will clean it up again as it was before. Note you can also change the alignment left or right or center. So I can just align it right, for instance, and I can also change the name because you notice here, if I add a property, it will prefix it automatically if it's an element property, a view property, or a service property. So in this case, element.BERT class. If I want to rename that just to class, because that's more like an internal name, you could say, you can right click on it, you can say change column name, and I'll just call it class. Simple and straightforward. That's more than sufficient. And maybe the alignment, it's maybe better to put it centered. Okay. So I've explained you about the set default columns and also the possibility to change the alignment and the name of the column. All of those settings that I'm currently doing, reorganizing a little bit how my alarm console looks like, which columns are being shown, the alignment, the custom names, that's all being stored with my user settings. So whenever I log in from any place onto the DataMiner system with my user, I will have again my personal preferences. Do note also that you can leverage the group settings to actually take your settings and apply it onto a whole group of people. So if you once configured it nicely how it should be for everybody, you can take those group settings and actually apply them to a whole group of users, and they automatically have those available. Now there's one last alarm property that I needed to explain, and those are the custom properties on the alarms itself. And that's done in the right click of the alarm. So as I explained, you can add columns and you can add properties of elements, services and views, but also of alarms, properties of alarms. I can actually add custom properties on alarm. I can create a brand new column with user definable information. How can I do that? Well, if you right click on any alarm, doesn't really matter which one, and I go to the properties of that alarm, like we did with our element and went to the properties, you will see here that again we have the general properties, the system default properties, a list of things that are always there, and we have the custom tab page. So here we can actually add a new column or a new property on the alarms and basically make it user definable. There are already two properties, but let me quickly add a new one just to get a hang of it. It's the same thing as with adding a property on the element as we did before. So let's go for a trouble ticket. We already had tickets, but I'll call it a trouble ticket. And then I will just say like, okay, any value can just be typed and you can use regular expressions or possible values. I'm just gonna leave it all values. You can just type in whatever you want. Okay, simple as that. I added a new column, but I still need to visualize it. So I right click and I say add and remove. I right click on the header and I say add and remove. And now underneath the alarm properties, you will find that trouble ticket there. Let me add that and maybe move it to the front again so that we nicely see it over there. And here I have my trouble ticket field. It's all empty because I didn't define any values yet, of course. And how can I define a value? Well, you can go to the right click to the properties to custom and type something in there. I'm gonna cancel that because I also have a pencil icon here, and immediately I can inline edit and add, for instance, a reference to a trouble ticket ID of another system. So this is a very manual, basic way. You just type over the element or the trouble ticket ID from another system right into the alarm here. That's a very basic. We will see there are some more automated ways of doing that as well. But that's the first way of linking to another trouble ticketing system, adding basically additional information to your alarms in your DataMiner system. A small note, as with the element properties or service or view properties, if you would ever remove a property from your system, they will be gone throughout your system on all the alarms. And this is, of course, something you do on the system. So if I add this property, trouble tickets, all the other people in the logging into the system will also be able to see that additional property or the additional column. They do need to visualize it on all though. So they need to add that column into their alarm console. That's where the group settings might come in handy if you configure it once you push it to everybody. So that was a little bit on the alarm columns. So we took a look at some of the basic columns that are available there, what they mean, how to add additional information that might be interesting for you, showing or hiding additional columns with some tweaking on the name and the alignments. And we also saw that there are some special columns, like for instance, the action buttons or the trend line or the heat line that is that you can show in the alarm console. And then of course the properties, not only element properties, view and service properties, but also alarm properties, adding a brand new column in your alarm console with your information in there. Okay, that's for the alarm columns. Let's now move on to the next one.